The stars stretched across the black sky like endless silver dust. A single ship cut through the darkness, silent and sharp. Inside sat a man, alone in the cockpit. His name was Daniel Cross. He was a trader, sometimes a smuggler, sometimes worse. He worked for those who had money and power, even if it meant dirty jobs. This time, the job was darker than usual. His orders were simple. Find an alien widow and her daughter, capture them, and sell them to the overlords. The pay was high. The punishment for failure was higher. Daniel leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the glowing screen. A picture of his targets floated there. The widow looked tired, thin, her large black eyes filled with sorrow. The little girl, no more than 8, clung to her mother's arm. They were poor, harmless, and frightened. He frowned. Why would the overlords want them? They were no soldiers, no leaders. They were nothing but survivors on a forgotten planet. Still, Daniel had learned long ago not to ask questions. Questions brought pain. Questions brought death. The ship shook as it entered the planet's thin atmosphere. Below spread a land of dust and broken stone, a place where no one chose to live. Old mines lay in ruins, rusted machines poked out of the ground like bones. The colony had been abandoned by humans long ago, but some aliens stayed behind, too poor or too stubborn to leave. Daniel guided his ship down, landing near the edge of the ruins. The engines hissed as they cooled. He grabbed his blaster, strapped it to his hip, and stepped outside. The air smelled dry, filled with sand and metal. The silence was heavy, broken only by the wind. He walked through empty streets, his boots crunching against gravel. Buildings leaned like tired giants, their walls cracked and broken. Shadows moved between them, but when he turned, nothing was there. The people here were hiding. They caught home. Knew a hunter had come. A voice echoed in his memory, the voice of his employer. Do not fail, Daniel. Bring the widow and her child. They are valuable. Do not ask why. Daniel gritted his teeth. He hated when jobs felt wrong, but money was money. Without it, he was nothing. Without it, he was just another starving body in space. He reached what looked like an old shelter. The door was broken, hanging from one hinge. He stepped inside. The air was colder, the light dim. He raised his scanner, and it beeped softly. The signal was close, very close. He moved deeper, every step slow, careful. His hand hovered over his blaster. He could hear breathing, not his own, and then he saw them. In the far corner, behind broken crates, the widow crouched, shielding her daughter with her body. Her eyes widened as she saw him, fear and despair mixed together. The little girl clutched her mother's torn dress, shaking. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Daniel looked at them. They were not monsters. They were not dangerous. They were just people. Tired, poor, scared people. The mother whispered something in her own tongue, soft and trembling. Daniel couldn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. She was begging him not to hurt her child. His chest tightened. He had captured many before, some guilty, some innocent. He had delivered them all without thinking, but this time, it felt different. The little girl peeked out from her mother's arms. Her eyes met his, big, bright eyes filled with fear and hope. Daniel froze. This was supposed to be simple. Capture them, deliver them, get paid. That was all. No emotions, no second thoughts. But standing there, staring at them, he felt something heavy inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. Guilt. The girl whispered, her voice tiny but clear. Please, don't. The words struck him harder than all. And any weapon. She spoke in broken human language, but it was enough. Daniel's hand dropped from his blaster. He stepped back, heart pounding. No one had ever begged him like that. No one had ever looked at him as if he were the only hope in a dying world. His mind raced. If he didn't take them, the overlords would know. They would hunt him. They would kill him. But if he did take them, he would be delivering them to a fate worse than death. The air grew heavier, the silence louder. He realized the choice was no longer about money or survival. It was about something else, something he had almost forgotten. His humanity. The mother clutched her child tighter, waiting for his move. Her breath came in quick gasps, her body shaking. She thought he was about to end her life. But Daniel didn't raise his weapon. Instead, he whispered to himself, almost too soft to hear, This is wrong." Outside in the ruins, shadows moved again. The hunters of the overlords were already searching. Time was running out. Daniel stood frozen between duty and conscience, between greed and mercy. He was sent here to sell them. But as he looked into the eyes of the child, he felt the first spark of a dangerous thought. What if, Instead of betraying them, he became their protector. The mission was no longer simple. It had become something else, something that could change his life forever. The ruined shelter was quiet, but inside, Daniel's heart beat loud in his chest. He had found them, the alien widow and her little daughter, the very people he was supposed to capture. Yet instead of reaching for his blaster, he stood still, staring at them. The widow's breathing was fast, sharp. She pressed her daughter close to her chest, as if her arms alone could protect the child from the universe. Dust covered her hair and her long dark clothes. Her eyes, large, glassy, filled with fear, watched Daniel's every movement. The little girl was thinner than he expected. Her arms looked fragile, her cheeks hollow, but her eyes were alive. They were not filled with hate, not even anger. They were filled with hope, the kind of hope that burned even in the darkest places. Daniel felt his throat tighten. The widow whispered something again in her alien tongue. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. She was pleading not for herself, but for the child in her arms. Daniel knelt slowly, lowering himself so he wouldn't look like a predator. He took off his gloves and raised his empty hands to show he meant no harm. The little girl peeked out. For a moment, she looked ready to hide again, but then softly she asked, "You hurt us?" Her voice was broken, her words clumsy, but Daniel understood. He shook his head. "No, I will not hurt you." The widow's shoulders dropped a little, but her eyes stayed sharp. She didn't trust him, not yet. Daniel swallowed. He needed to say something that could ease their fear. But what words could possibly erase the shadow of men like him? Men who hunted for money. The little girl moved first. She let go of her mother's arm and crawled forward inch by inch as if testing the ground. Her big eyes never left Daniel's face. When she was close enough, she reached out her tiny hand and touched his boot. "Safe," she whispered. Daniel felt his chest twist. No one had called him that before. No one had looked at him as if he was safety. He had been called many things, smuggler, thief, criminal, but never that. He nodded. "Yes, safe." The girl smiled, a small, trembling smile. She crawled back to her mother and whispered something in her ear. The widow looked at Daniel again, her eyes softer now, still guarded but softer. For a long time, no one spoke. Only the sound of wind moving through the broken walls filled the air. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "Why are they after you?" The widow's lips trembled. She struggled with his language. "Those," she tried. Her words came slow, heavy, broken. "Overlords, kill my husband. Take land, take food. We hide. Only we left." Daniel clenched his jaw. The overlords had destroyed countless lives. He had worked for them before, delivering goods, carrying weapons, but hearing it from her lips made the evil sharper, more real. The widow looked down at her daughter. "They want her, child strong, special. They take children." Daniel's stomach turned cold. He didn't ask why the child was special. He didn't need to. He had seen enough empires take children, train them, break them. The overlords wanted soldiers, servants, tools, and he was supposed to deliver her to them. The little girl crawled forward again, sitting on her knees now, staring at him. "You take us?" she asked. Her words stabbed deeper than any knife. Daniel couldn't answer. His throat felt dry, his chest heavy. He wanted to tell her the truth, that yes, he was sent to take her, that yes, he was meant to sell them both like objects. But when he looked at her small face, he couldn't. Instead, he said, "No, I take you away." The widow gasped, her eyes wide. The child tilted her head, confused but hopeful. Daniel leaned closer. "Listen to me. They sent me to find you. They want me to give you to them, but I won't. Do you hear me? I won't." The widow's lips parted in shock. Her daughter blinked, as if not believing what she heard. Daniel sighed, rubbing his face with his hands. "You don't know me. You don't trust me. I understand. But I can't do this to you. Not to her. Not to a child." The widow whispered something in her language, tears shining in her eyes. She held her daughter tighter, kissing her head. The little girl stood up and walked to Daniel. She touched his hand, small fingers trembling. Then she whispered one word. "Father?" The sound broke him. He shook his head quickly. No, I am not." But the child smiled as if she had already decided. In her eyes, he was not a hunter, not a traitor, not a criminal. In her eyes, he was something else. A protector. Daniel looked away, fighting the storm in his chest. He had lived his whole life for himself. He had never cared about anyone else. But now, staring at this fragile child and her broken mother, he felt something he thought had died long ago. The need to protect. Outside, the sound of engines echoed. The hunters of the overlords were drawing near. Daniel stood up fast. "We must go, now." The widow hesitated, fear flashing in her eyes, but then she saw her daughter holding his hand, and she understood. For the first time she nodded. Daniel pulled them close, scanning the ruins for a way out. His mission had changed. His life had changed. He had come here to sell them. But now, he had chosen something far more dangerous. He had chosen to become their family. The ruins shook with the distant roar of engines. Daniel's heart raced as he pulled the widow and her daughter deeper into the shadows. The hunters were coming. The overlords did not wait long when their orders were ignored. The widow clutched her daughter tightly, her large dark eyes wide with fear. The little girl, however, kept staring at Daniel with trust, as if she already knew he was different from the monsters who wanted her. Daniel pressed his back against a cracked wall. His blaster was heavy at his side, but his thoughts were heavier. He had a decision to make, one that could change everything. He could follow the mission, capture them, deliver them, get his pay, stay alive. Or he could run, defy the overlords, protect this widow and her child, risk his life for strangers. The choice felt like a stone pressing on his chest. The girl whispered, her voice tiny but steady. "Safe?" Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. That word again. Safe. She looked at him as if he were her shield, her only hope. When he opened his eyes, the engines were louder. Dust trembled from the ceiling. He had no more time to think. He turned to the widow. "Listen, if I leave you here, they will find you. If I give you to them, they will take her away. You know this?" The widow's lips trembled. She nodded, tears slipping down her face. Daniel continued, his voice low but sharp. "But if you come with me, if you trust me, then maybe, just maybe, I can keep you alive." The widow looked down at her daughter. The little girl held Daniel's hand and whispered something in her alien tongue. The widow hesitated, then nodded again, stronger this time. The choice was made. Daniel took a deep breath. He wasn't working for the overlords anymore. He wasn't their tool, their dog. For the first time in years, he was making his own decision. And that decision was simple: protect them. They moved quickly through the ruins, keeping low. The sound of engines grew closer, then stopped. Silence filled the air, a silence that was worse than noise. Daniel raised his blaster, scanning the broken streets. He knew how the overlords hunted. First the scouts, then the soldiers, then the drones. Once they had your scent, they didn't stop. The widow walked behind him, holding her daughter's hand. The child struggled to keep up, her small legs stumbling over stones. Every time she tripped, Daniel wanted to pick her up, but he needed his hands free. They reached an old tunnel, half buried in sand. Daniel pushed aside the debris and motioned them inside. It was dark, damp, but it gave them cover. They crouched in the shadows, waiting. The widow spoke softly, her voice trembling. "Why? Help us. You. No need." Daniel stared at the ground. Why? He had asked himself the same question. Why risk everything for them? Why throw away his safety, his pay, his life? He finally said, "Because it's wrong. Because I'm tired of doing what they want. Because she..." He looked at the little girl. "She sees me as something I never thought I could be." The widow tilted her head, confused but thoughtful. The little girl crawled into his lap without fear. She rested her head against his chest. Daniel froze, his body stiff, then slowly relaxed. He felt the warmth of her small body, the trust she had given him without hesitation. And with that, the choice he had made burned deeper into his heart. He wasn't just protecting them out of guilt. He was protecting them because they had become something more, something like family. Outside, heavy footsteps echoed. Shadows passed near the tunnel entrance. Daniel held his breath, one hand over the child's back, the other gripping his blaster. The widow covered her mouth to stay silent. The hunters stopped. Daniel could hear their voices, low, sharp, metallic. They scanned the ruins with machines that whined in the night. "Target near," one of them growled in broken human speech. "Widow and child must not escape." Daniel's grip tightened. He knew what would happen if they were caught. He could already imagine the chains around the widow's arms, the girl ripped from her mother's hands. He could see the overlords smiling as they paid him in blood money. No, not this time. The hunters moved on, their shadows sliding away. The tunnel fell silent again. Daniel let out the breath he was holding. The widow leaned against the wall, trembling with relief. The child stayed curled in his arms, as if she had found her place there. He looked down at her, brushing dust from her hair. For years, he had lived like a machine, follow orders, get paid, survive. But holding her now, he felt alive for the first time. The choice was clear. He wasn't just protecting them for tonight. He was protecting them for as long as it took. Even if the overlords came with armies, even if it meant his death. Daniel whispered to himself, almost like a vow. "You're not alone anymore. Not while I breathe." The widow lifted her head, staring at him with wide eyes. She didn't speak, but in her gaze he saw something stronger than words: gratitude, trust. The little girl stirred, whispering in her soft, broken voice, "Father." Daniel closed his eyes, his chest aching. He wasn't her father, and he knew that, but maybe in some way, he could become one. The engines roared again in the distance. The hunt was far from over, but Daniel had made his choice, and he would fight the universe itself to keep it. The night sky above the ruins glowed faint red as searchlights swept across the broken colony. Engines rumbled, metal feet clanged, and sharp voices cut through the silence. The Overlord's hunters were here. Daniel pressed himself against the cold tunnel wall, the widow and her daughter huddled close behind him. The girl's small fingers clutched his arm, trembling, yet refusing to let go. "Quiet," Daniel whispered. His voice was calm, but his heart thundered. Outside, the sound grew louder. Drones buzzed through the air like angry insects, their lights stabbing into every shadow. Heavy armored soldiers marched between the ruins, weapons ready. They were hunting, and they would not stop. The widow whispered in her broken human tongue, "They close." Daniel nodded. He knew she was right. The hunters were skilled. They would not give up. The overlords wanted the child, and when the overlords wanted something, they always got it, unless he stopped them. He motioned for the widow and the girl to follow. They slipped deeper into the tunnel, stepping over broken metal and old bones. Daniel's scanner showed a path that led back to the surface, far from the soldiers. But the hunters were already spreading out. The little girl stumbled on a stone. Daniel caught her before she could fall, lifting her into his arms. She buried her face against his chest, trying to be brave. "You're safe," he whispered. Her tiny hands gripped his jacket. "Safe. With you." The words gave him strength. He moved faster. They emerged from the tunnel into a wide canyon behind the ruins. The ground was rough, filled with jagged rocks. Strange glowing plants pulsed faint blue in. The cracks. The canyon walls rose high, cutting them off from the stars. Daniel scanned the sky. Drones swept past, their red beams flashing dangerously close. He pulled the widow and girl under a rock ledge just as a drone flew over. The machine hovered, its sensors whining, searching. Daniel held his breath. His hand was on his blaster, ready to fire if it saw them. Seconds stretched like hours, then the drone zipped away. The widow let out a shaky breath. Daniel leaned close. "We keep moving. No stopping." She nodded. But the hunters were not blind. One of the soldiers found tracks near the ruins, the faint prints of small feet. The sound of a horn blasted through the night. "They found us," Daniel muttered. Suddenly the canyon shook with movement. Lights appeared at both ends. Soldiers were closing in from both sides. Trapped. Daniel scanned quickly. The only way out was up. A jagged cliff face loomed beside them. It was steep, dangerous, but it was the only chance. He turned to the widow. "Climb. Take her. I'll cover you." The widow's eyes widened in fear. "No, you come too." "I will," Daniel promised. "But first you go. Hurry." The widow nodded, lifting her daughter onto the rocks. The girl scrambled upward, her small hands gripping tight. The widow climbed after her, her movements shaky but determined. Daniel stayed below, drawing his blaster. Shadows moved in the canyon. Red eyes glowed. The hunters were close now. The first soldier appeared, armored and tall, his weapon humming with deadly energy. Daniel fired. The blast struck the soldier's chest, sending him crashing into the dirt. Another came. Daniel fired again, sparks lighting the night. "Climb faster," he shouted. The widow pulled her daughter higher. The girl looked down, fear in her eyes. "Come safe, man," she cried. Daniel's chest burned at the sound, but he couldn't move yet. He fired again, hitting another soldier. But there were too many. Their footsteps thundered, their weapons aimed. Finally, the widow and the girl reached the top. The widow stretched her arm down. "Come," she cried. Daniel fired one last shot, then leapt to the rocks. His fingers clawed at the jagged surface as blasts exploded around him. Stones broke under his boots. He climbed faster, muscles burning. A shot seared past his shoulder, close enough to scorch his jacket. He pulled himself higher, teeth gritted. The widow and girl reached down, their hands trembling but strong. With one final push, Daniel grasped their hands. Together they pulled him up. He rolled onto the top of the cliff, gasping for air. Below, the soldiers shouted in anger, their weapons firing into the rock. But the cliff was too high. For now, they were safe. They ran across the plateau, the cold wind cutting their faces. The widow's breath came in ragged gasps, the girl clinging to Daniel's hand. Behind them, the hunters regrouped. Drones lifted higher, scanning the cliffs. Daniel knew this chase would not end here. The overlords never gave up. But he also knew one thing. He would not give up either. The little girl stumbled again, exhausted. Daniel scooped her into his arms without stopping. She rested her head against his chest, whispering, "Safe." He looked at the widow, who was barely keeping pace. She met his eyes, and in them he saw both fear and trust. They trusted him with their lives, and he would not fail them. As dawn crept across the horizon, painting the sky with pale light, Daniel led them toward the mountains beyond the colony. The chase was only beginning, but he was ready. For the first time in his life, Daniel wasn't running for himself. He was running for them, his family. The mountains rose tall and sharp against the pale sky. Jagged peaks cut into the horizon like the teeth of some ancient beast. Daniel led the way up a narrow path, his blaster drawn, eyes scanning for danger. The widow and her daughter followed close, behind, their steps slow, their bodies weary. The night chase had drained them. Their faces were pale, their movements weak. The little girl clung to Daniel's hand whenever the path grew steep, her small legs trembling with effort. Still, she did not complain. She only whispered that word again and again, like a prayer. Safe. Each time she said it, Daniel felt a weight inside his chest. He had never been anyone's safe place before. He had been a weapon, a traitor, a shadow in dark corners of the galaxy, but never this. The path ended in a hidden valley, quiet and untouched. Strange glowing flowers swayed in the cold wind, their light soft and calming. At the far side stood an old structure, an abandoned human outpost, rusted but strong. Daniel scanned it quickly. It was empty, safe enough for now. Here, he said, motioning them inside. The widow guided her daughter to the floor, helping her sit. The girl leaned against the wall, her eyelids heavy. She was exhausted. Daniel found a broken crate and sat down, his blaster resting on his knee. His body ached from the climb, but his mind would not rest. He knew the hunters would not stop. The overlords wanted the child. They would send more soldiers, more drones. And yet, despite the danger, Daniel felt something strange here in this quiet valley. For the first time in years, he felt human. The widow broke the silence. Her voice was low, heavy with pain. "You risk life. For us. Why?" Daniel looked at her. Her face was worn, lines of suffering carved deep into her skin, but her eyes burned with strength. She had lost much, yet she still stood. He shook his head. "Because I couldn't do it. I couldn't give you to them." The widow lowered her gaze. "Others, they give. For money, for fear." Daniel thought of the many times he had done the same, delivered people, stolen supplies, carried weapons. He had told it. Himself, it was survival. But survival had made him a servant to evil. "I was like them once," he admitted, "but not anymore." The widow studied him for a long moment, then whispered, "You change, because of her." Daniel glanced at the girl. She had fallen asleep, curled against the wall, her small hands clutching her mother's torn dress. Her breathing was soft, peaceful, as if she trusted the world again. "Yes," Daniel said quietly, "because of her." Hours passed. The valley remained silent. Daniel fixed a small fire from scraps of wood, enough to keep them warm. The widow sat across from him, her daughter resting in her lap. At last, the widow began to speak. Her words were broken, but Daniel listened closely. "My husband was farmer. Good man. He grow food for many. Overlords come. They take land. They say food belong to them. My husband fight. He say no. They kill him." Her voice trembled, but she went on. "After, they burn home. Take our people. Sell them. Only we escape. We hide. Many years. Always running." She touched her daughter's hair gently. "They want her. She is strong. She learns fast. She remembers everything. They want to take children like her, turn them into soldiers, slaves." Daniel felt anger rise in his chest. He had seen the overlords break children before, train them, strip them of hope, turn them into weapons. He had looked away then, but now he couldn't, not when it was her. "I won't let them," he said firmly, "not while I live." The widow's eyes glistened with tears. She looked at him, not with suspicion now, but with something else, something close to trust. Later that night, Daniel sat near the fire, unable to sleep. The little girl stirred in her dreams, then crawled toward him. She climbed into his lap as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Daniel froze at first, awkward and unsure. But when she rested her head against his chest, he let his arms wrap around her gently. "You trust me too much," he whispered. The girl murmured, half asleep, "Because you are father now." Daniel closed his eyes. Her words cut deep yet warmed him in ways he could not explain. He was not her father. He could never replace the man she had lost. But if she needed him to be that, then maybe he could try. For years, Daniel had lived only for himself. Now he felt something larger, something heavier, responsibility. He had chosen to protect them, but now it wasn't just a choice, it was a bond. The widow watched quietly from the other side of the fire. She saw how her daughter clung to Daniel, how his rough hands held her with surprising gentleness. She saw the change in his eyes, the change in his voice. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "Maybe we not alone anymore." The fire crackled. The stars wheeled silently above the mountains. For the first time in years, there was no fear in the little girl's sleep, no trembling, no cries. For the first time in years, there was hope. And in that quiet valley, under the broken sky, a man, a widow, and her child began to feel something stronger than fear. They began to feel like a family. The hidden valley gave them one night of peace. But Daniel knew it would not last. The overlords never stopped. When they wanted something, they sent wave after wave until nothing was left. At dawn, Daniel stood outside the broken outpost, scanning the horizon. His eyes narrowed. In the far distance, dark shapes moved against the rising sun. Drones, soldiers, hunters. They were coming. His jaw tightened. He could run again, yes, but for how long? The widow and her child were exhausted. Their bodies were weak. He couldn't drag them across mountains forever. The overlords would always find them. No, running was no longer enough. He turned to the outpost, its walls rusted but strong. Inside were scraps of metal, broken machines, and old weapons left behind by humans. It wasn't much, but it was something. Daniel's eyes hardened. This was where he would make his stand. The widow stepped out, her daughter at her side. "They come?" she asked, her voice tense. Daniel nodded. "Yes, they'll be here soon." Fear filled her eyes, but she did not argue. Instead, she touched her daughter's shoulder and whispered in their own language. The child clung to her, then looked up at Daniel. "You fight?" the girl asked softly. Daniel crouched in front of her. "Yes, I fight. For you." The girl's eyes glistened. She whispered that word again, the word that had already changed his life. "Safe." Daniel nodded. "Safe, I promise." He worked quickly, gathering what he could. He built traps from old wires and fuel cells, placing them at choke points near the outpost entrance. He repaired a mounted turret half buried in dust, feeding it power from the ship's spare cells. Every movement was sharp, focused. He was no longer just a smuggler or trader. He was a soldier now, not for money, not for survival, but for family. The widow helped in silence, carrying scraps, tying wires. She was afraid, yes, but she stood beside him without hesitation. Together, they prepared. When everything was ready, Daniel loaded his blaster and looked at the widow. "If I fall, take her. Run, don't look back." The widow shook her head fiercely. "No, we stand, together." Daniel met her eyes. For a moment, no words passed, only understanding. The first drone appeared before noon, its red eye scanning the valley. It hovered, humming, before releasing a sharp signal, a beacon. Daniel raised his blaster and fired. The drone exploded in a flash of sparks, but the damage was done. The hunters knew where they were. The ground shook as armored transports rolled into the valley. Soldiers marched out, tall and cold, their weapons glowing. Drones filled the sky like black insects, their lights slicing through the shadows. The widow pulled her daughter into the outpost, shielding her. Daniel stood at the entrance, blaster ready, heart steady. "They want to fight," he muttered. "Turd. Then let's give them one." The first wave came fast. Drones swooped low, scanning. Daniel fired, hitting 2 out of the sky. The others returned fire, blasting the walls. Sparks and dust rained down, but the outpost held. Soldiers advanced, heavy footsteps shaking the ground. Daniel triggered one of his traps. An old fuel cell exploded beneath their feet, sending fire and metal flying. 2 soldiers fell, armor shattered. The others kept coming. Daniel fired again, his shots sharp and precise. One by one they fell, but more replaced them. The overlords had endless soldiers. Inside, the widow whispered prayers, holding her daughter close. The girl, though afraid, peeked out, her small eyes locked on Daniel. She did not cry. She did not scream. She simply whispered, "Father." The word gave Daniel strength. He roared and fired again, moving like a storm. Hours passed like minutes. The battle raged. Smoke filled the valley. Fire lit the sky. Daniel's body ached, his arms heavy, but he did not stop. Every time he thought of surrender, he looked at the girl. Safe. He would keep her safe, no matter the cost. At last, the final wave came. A massive armored hunter, taller than any soldier, stepped into the valley. Its eyes glowed red, its weapon twice the size of Daniel. Daniel staggered, bleeding from a wound in his shoulder. His blaster overheated, sparks flying. The widow cried out from inside, "Daniel!" The giant hunter raised its weapon. Daniel gritted his teeth, refusing to fall. He stumbled to the turret, slammed his hand on the power switch, and aimed. The weapon roared, firing a stream of burning plasma. The giant staggered, its armor melting, before collapsing in a blast of smoke and fire. Silence fell. The valley was still. The hunters were gone. Daniel dropped to his knees, chest heaving. His vision blurred, blood dripped from his arm, his facial mark. But he was alive, and more importantly, so were they. The widow ran to him, pulling him up with surprising strength. The little girl wrapped her arms around him, crying into his chest. "You fight?" the girl asked softly. Daniel crouched in front of her. "Yes, I fight. For you." The girl's eyes glistened. She whispered that word again, the word that had already changed his life. "Safe." Daniel nodded. "Safe. I promise." He worked quickly, gathering what he could. He built traps from old wires and fuel cells, placing them at choke points near the outpost entrance. He repaired a mounted turret half buried in dust, feeding it power from the ship's spare cells. Every movement was sharp, focused. He was no longer just a smuggler or trader. He was a soldier now, not for money, not for survival, but for family. The widow helped in silence, carrying scraps, tying wires. She was afraid, yes, but she stood beside him without hesitation. Together they prepared. When everything was ready, Daniel loaded his blaster and looked at the widow. "If I fall, take her. Run. Don't look back." The widow shook her head fiercely. "No, we stand. Together." Daniel met her eyes. For a moment, no words passed, only understanding. The first drone appeared before noon, its red eyes scanning the valley. It hovered, humming, before releasing a sharp signal. A beacon. Daniel raised his blaster and fired. The drone exploded in a flash of sparks, but the damage was done. The hunters knew where they were. The ground shook as armored transports rolled into the valley. Soldiers marched out, tall and cold, their weapons glowing. Drones filled the sky like black insects, their lights slicing through the shadows. The widow pulled her daughter into the outpost, shielding her. Daniel stood at the entrance, blaster ready, heart steady. "They want to fight," he muttered. "Then let's give them one." The first wave came fast. Drones swooped low, scanning. Daniel fired, hitting 2 out of the sky. The others returned fire, blasting the walls. Sparks and dust rained down, but the outposts held. Soldiers advanced, heavy footsteps shaking the ground. Daniel triggered one of his traps. An old fuel cell exploded beneath their feet, sending fire and metal flying. 2 soldiers fell, armor shattered. The others kept coming. Daniel fired again, his shots sharp and precise. One by one they fell, but more replaced them. The overlords had endless soldiers. Inside, the widow whispered prayers, holding her daughter close. The girl, though afraid, peeked out, her small eyes locked on Daniel. She did not cry. She did not scream. She simply whispered, "Father." The word gave Daniel strength. He roared and fired again, moving like a storm. Hours passed like minutes. The battle raged. Smoke filled the valley. Fire lit the sky. Daniel's body ached, his arms heavy, but he did not stop. Every time he thought of surrender, he looked at the girl, safe. He would keep her safe, no matter the cost. At last, the final wave came. A massive armored hunter, taller than any soldier, stepped into the valley. Its eyes glowed red, its weapon twice the size of Daniel. Daniel staggered, bleeding from a wound in his shoulder. His blaster overheated, sparks flying. The widow cried out from inside, "Daniel!" The giant hunter raised its weapon. Daniel gritted his teeth, refusing to fall. He stumbled to the turret, slammed his hand on the power switch, and aimed. The weapon roared, firing a stream of burning plasma. The giant staggered, its armor melting before collapsing in a blast of smoke and fire. Silence fell. The valley was still. The hunters were gone. Daniel dropped to his knees, chest heaving. His vision blurred. Blood dripped from his arm, his face, but he was alive, and more importantly, so were they. The widow ran to him, pulling him up with surprising strength. The little girl wrapped her arms around him, crying into his chest. "You fight," she whispered. "You win." Daniel smiled weakly, resting a hand on her head. "For you." The widow's eyes filled with tears. "You save us." Daniel shook his head. "No, we saved each other." That night, the fire burned again in the outpost. The widow tended his wounds with what little herbs she had. The girl slept beside him, her tiny hands still gripping his jacket. Daniel stared into the flames, his body aching, his soul heavy. He had made his stand, and he had won. But he knew the overlords would not stop. They would return, stronger, angrier. And yet, for the first time, Daniel was not afraid. Because he was no longer fighting for himself. He was fighting for his family. The valley was silent after the battle. Smoke curled from broken machines. The air smelled of fire and ash, but no footsteps echoed anymore. The hunters were gone. Daniel sat near the entrance of the outpost, his body wrapped in cloth where the widow had tended his wounds. His shoulder burned, his legs ached, but he was alive. He breathed slow and heavy, his mind still hearing the echoes of blaster fire. Beside him, the little girl slept, her head resting on his lap. Even in sleep, her small fingers clutched his jacket, refusing to let go. She looked peaceful, safe, as if the chaos of the world outside could not touch her now. The widow sat across from him, watching in silence. Her dark eyes reflected the firelight, soft but strong. For the first time since he had met her, there was no fear in her face, only something new, trust. Daniel broke the silence first. His voice was low, tired. "They'll come back. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but they'll come." The widow nodded slowly. "Yes, overlords never stop." Daniel stroked the girl's hair gently. "Then we won't stop either." The widow tilted her head. "You mean we run again?" Daniel looked up at the stars above the broken roof. "Not just run. We build. We fight. We find others. There are more like you, families, children. They need someone to stand for them." The widow's lips trembled. "You stand for us. Alone. You almost die." Daniel shook his head. "I didn't stand alone. You helped. She gave me strength." He looked at the sleeping child and smiled faintly. "Without her, I wouldn't have fought." The widow lowered her eyes, tears glistening. She whispered softly, "She calls you father." Daniel froze, his chest tightening. The word had pierced him before, but now, after the fire and blood of battle, it carried a new weight. He was not her father by blood, but by choice. Maybe he was. He placed his hand gently over the girl's. "If she wants me to be, then I will." The widow looked at him for a long time, her gaze heavy with meaning. Finally, she whispered, "Then we are family now." The next days passed in quiet recovery. Daniel repaired what he could of the outpost, patching walls, setting traps again. The widow gathered food from the valley, roots, fruit, water from hidden streams. Together, they created something they had never had before. A home. It was small, fragile, hidden under the mountains, but it was theirs. The girl laughed for the first time one evening, chasing fireflies that glowed like tiny stars. Her laughter echoed across the valley, light and pure. Daniel sat by the fire, listening, his chest warm. He realized he had not heard such a sound in years. It was the sound of hope. The widow watched her daughter with soft eyes. She turned to Daniel. "She is happy. I did not think she could ever be happy again." Daniel smiled faintly. Children should laugh, not hide, not fear. The widow studied him. "You, different than before. When you first come, your eyes were cold. Now, warm." Daniel looked into the flames. "Because I was empty. I lived for nothing but money. But now," he paused, searching for words, "now I have something worth living for, worth dying for." The widow said nothing, but in her silence was agreement. One night, when the stars burned bright above, the little girl crawled into Daniel's arms before sleep. She looked up at him with clear, shining eyes. "You stay?" she whispered. Daniel held her close. Yes, I stay. You don't sell us? She asked, her voice trembling. Daniel's throat tightened. He kissed the top of her head gently. Never. I will never sell you. I will protect you. Always. The girl smiled, her eyes closing as she drifted into sleep. Daniel held her tightly, his heart heavy but full. He knew then that his life had changed forever. He was no longer Daniel the smuggler, Daniel the traitor, Daniel the servant of overlords. He was Daniel, the father, the protector, the man who had chosen love over survival. Weeks turned into months. The outpost became stronger. The widow and Daniel worked side by side, patching walls, planting seeds, shaping a place where life could grow again. Sometimes Daniel would scout the edges of the mountains, watching for enemies. Sometimes he would hunt, bringing back food. And sometimes when the nights were quiet, he would sit by the fire with the widow and the girl, telling stories of stars and ships, listening to the child laugh, listening to the widow hum old songs. It was not perfect. The world outside was still cruel, still dangerous. The overlords still ruled, their shadows stretching across planets. But inside their valley, inside their home, there was something the overlords could not touch. Family. One evening, as the firelight danced on the walls, Daniel whispered to himself, "They sent me here to sell them, to break them, to destroy what little hope they had left." But instead, he looked at the widow, her soft eyes meeting his. He looked at the girl, sleeping with a smile on her face. "Instead, I found something I didn't know I was missing." He closed his eyes, the fire warming his face. "I found my family." And for the first time in his life, Daniel Cross was not running, not hiding, not surviving. He was living,